December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tranquil harbor where the might of America's Pacific Fleet rested at anchor, its crew members just beginning to stir for Sunday morning duties. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, thousands of miles away, aboard the flagship Nagato, waited confidently for reports of what he believed would be Japan's greatest military triumph, a decisive blow that would force the United States to negotiate peace on Japanese terms. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What follows is not merely an account of military reversals, but a testament to how industrial might and strategic adaptation would transform America's greatest naval disaster into Japan's complete maritime annihilation. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida banked his Nakajima B-5N bomber slightly as he approached the island of Oahu. Below him stretched the panorama of Pearl Harbor, a sight that filled him with a sense of destiny. As the leader of the airstrike force, he had rehearsed this moment countless times. The Americans were unprepared, their battleships neatly aligned like targets in a shooting gallery. At 7:49 a.m., Fuchida keyed his radio and transmitted the code words that would launch Japan's bid for Pacific dominance. Tora, 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 attack, success, surprise. 5 miles below, Seaman First Class James Harrington stood on the quarterdeck of the USS Oklahoma, enjoying the gentle Hawaiian breeze. At 22 years old, the farm boy from Iowa had been in the Navy for just 11 months and considered his assignment to the Pacific Fleet a stroke of good fortune. His thoughts drifted to home, to Christmas packages that might be waiting, and to Betty, the girl who'd promised to wait for him. These pleasant musings were shattered by the distant drone of aircraft engines, followed by the surreal sight of planes bearing the distinctive red circle of Japan's rising sun. "General quarters! General quarters! This is not a drill!" The announcement blared through the ship's speakers as the first bombs began to fall. Harrington ran toward his battle station, but never reached it. A torpedo slammed into the Oklahoma's port side, the first of many that would soon capsize the massive warship. As the deck tilted beneath him, Harrington grabbed a railing, watching in horror as men and equipment slid across the steel surface into the churning water below. In Tokyo, Naval Minister Admiral Koshiro Oikawa received the initial reports with measured satisfaction. 8 American battleships sunk or severely damaged, over 180 aircraft destroyed, minimal losses to our forces. The Imperial Japanese Navy had delivered a masterstroke. Years of planning, months of training, and hours of precise execution had culminated in this moment of triumph. Japan had demonstrated its naval supremacy in the most dramatic fashion possible. "The Americans will sue for peace within 6 months, predicted Commander Takeo Yoshikawa, the naval intelligence officer who had spent months in Hawaii collecting information on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Their industrial capacity is impressive, but they lack the warrior spirit. They are soft, a nation of businessmen, not soldiers. What neither Yoshikawa nor any other Japanese strategist fully comprehended was the sleeping giant they had awakened. At the Mare Island Naval Shipyard near San Francisco, Submarine Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton received news of Pearl Harbor with cold fury. "They've made a grave mistake," he told his executive officer as they prepared the USS Wahoo for immediate deployment. "We're going to make them pay for every drop of American blood spilled today." Morton represented a new breed of American submarine commander, aggressive, innovative, and unbound by the cautious doctrine that had hampered U.S. submarine operations before the war. Standing at 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes, he had earned the nickname Mush, not for any softness of character, but ironically for his tough-as-nails reputation at the Naval Academy. Now, as he studied maps of the Pacific, He envisioned a new kind of warfare, one where American submarines would strangle Japan by cutting its maritime lifelines. The scope of America's industrial response to Pearl Harbor would soon become apparent. In 1941, the US had 51 fleet submarines in the Pacific. By 1945, that number would grow to 232. Where Japan had the capacity to produce approximately 2 submarines per month, American shipyards would eventually launch 3 submarines per week. This disparity in production capability was just beginning to manifest as Morton guided the Wahoo out of San Francisco Bay and into the vast Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-58 viewed America's entry into the war with a mixture of pride and caution. A graduate of the Naval Academy's 65th class, Hashimoto was a thoughtful officer who had studied Western industrial practices. "We must win quickly," he confided to his diary on December 10, 1941. "Time favors the Americans. For every ship we sink, they will build 3 more." By mid-1942, the strategic landscape of the Pacific War had begun to shift. The Battle of Midway in June had cost Japan 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots. More ominously for Japan, American submarine production was hitting its stride. The Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, and the Mare Island Naval Shipyard were now launching new Gato-class submarines at an astonishing rate. These submarines represented a quantum leap in capability, displacing 1 825 tons surfaced and 2 410 tons submerged. They could travel 11,000 nautical miles without refueling. Their top surface speed of 21 knots and submerged speed of 9 knots made them faster than their Japanese counterparts. Armed with 24 torpedoes and 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, each submarine was a potent weapon system designed for one purpose: to sever Japan's maritime lifelines. By contrast, Japan launched only 17 new submarines in all of 1942. Japanese Admiral Matome Ugaki noted in his diary, "The Americans are replacing their losses faster than we anticipated. Our intelligence reports that their shipyards are working around the clock. How can we compete with such production capacity?" The answer, as Japan would discover, was that they could not. Commander Charles "Swede" Momsen, architect of the U.S. Navy's submarine tactics, gathered his submarine skippers at Pearl Harbor in August 1942. The room contained a collection of America's most daring naval officers, men who would soon become legends in the silent service. "Gentlemen," Momsen began, pacing before a large map of the Pacific, "the Japanese Empire is an octopus, with its head in the home islands and its tentacles stretching across the Pacific. Our job is to cut off those tentacles one by one until the head starves." Momsen pointed to shipping lanes connecting Japan to its conquered territories. "These are your hunting grounds. The Japanese must ship oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and food from across their empire. Without these shipments, their war machine stops. It's that simple." The strategy Momsen outlined marked a dramatic shift in naval warfare. For centuries, navies had focused on destroying enemy warships. Now, America would wage economic warfare on an unprecedented scale, targeting the merchant vessels that kept Japan's economy functioning. This approach would prove devastating to an island nation that imported 90% of its oil and 80% of its strategic minerals. Among those listening intently was Commander Samuel D. Dealey of the USS Harder. At 36, Dealey was older than most submarine commanders, with a quiet demeanor that masked a calculating mind. "What about our torpedoes, sir?" he asked. "The magnetic detonators are still giving us problems." The question touched on a sensitive issue. American submariners had discovered that their primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo with its Mark 6 magnetic exploder, was deeply flawed. Torpedoes would often run too deep, pass under target ships without detonating, or explode prematurely. This technical failure was costing American lives and allowing Japanese ships to escape destruction. "Bureau of Ordnance is working on it," Mumson replied with evident frustration. "Until then, aim for direct hits and manual detonation, set depth shallower than recommended, and document every failure. We need evidence to force changes." The torpedo crisis highlighted a critical difference between American and Japanese military cultures. When confronted with equipment failures, American forces adapted, documented problems, and pushed for solutions. The Japanese military, bound by rigid hierarchical structures, often struggled to acknowledge and address technical deficiencies. By early 1943, American submariners had largely solved their torpedo problems through field modifications and persistent pressure on the Bureau of Ordnance. The result was immediate and devastating for Japan. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, executive officer of the USS Wahoo under Morton, later described their first patrol after fixing the torpedo issues. "We spotted a Japanese convoy near Palau on January 26th, 6 merchant ships with 2 destroyer escorts. Morton positioned us perfectly, and this time our torpedoes ran true. 3 freighters sank in less than 20 minutes. The escorts dropped depth charges, but they were poorly coordinated. We evaded easily and returned that night to sink another freighter." In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's headquarters began receiving alarming reports. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Miwa, commander of Japan's 6th Fleet submarine force, compiled statistics that showed a disturbing trend. "Our shipping losses increased by 67% in the first quarter of 1943, he reported to the Naval General Staff. "American submarine tactics have improved dramatically. They are now attacking in wolf packs, coordinating their approaches and striking with much greater accuracy." What Miwa could not fully appreciate was the technological edge that American submarines were gaining. By mid-1943, U.S. submarines were equipped with improved SJ surface search radar that could detect ships at ranges up to 10 miles, even in complete darkness. More critically, American code breakers had cracked Japanese naval codes, allowing submarine commanders to position their boats along known shipping routes exactly when convoys were expected to pass. Commander Takeo Nishino of the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze witnessed the growing American submarine threat firsthand. "We were escorting a convoy from Singapore to Japan in April 1943, he later recounted. 5 merchant vessels carrying rubber, tin and oil, vital war materials. Near the Philippine Sea, we detected an American submarine and drove it off with depth charges. We thought we were safe, but 2 nights later, 3 more submarines struck simultaneously from different directions. It was a perfectly coordinated attack. We lost 3 merchant ships within minutes." The statistics told the story of a mounting crisis for Japan. By the end of 1943, American submarines had sunk 335 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 1.5 million tons. Nearly 20% of Japan's merchant fleet had been destroyed in a single year. More alarmingly for Japanese naval planners, the rate of sinking was accelerating month by month as more American submarines entered the war and their tactics improved. Captain Chikao Yamamoto, head of the Imperial Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, presented a grim assessment to his superiors. "The Americans now have over 100 submarines operating in the Pacific. Our intelligence indicates they will add at least 80 more in 1944. We have neither the escort vessels nor the anti-submarine technology to counter this threat effectively." His warning fell on unreceptive ears. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, believed the decisive battle with America's surface fleet should remain Japan's priority. "We will destroy their carrier force in a final great battle," he insisted. Once their offensive capability is broken, their submarines will be forced to withdraw. This fundamental misunderstanding of America's strategy would prove fatal for Japan. While Imperial Navy planners focused on conserving strength for a decisive battle that would never come on their terms, American submarines methodically dismantled Japan's maritime economy. The human dimension of this submarine campaign was experienced by ordinary Japanese civilians like Hiroko Tanaka, a schoolteacher in Osaka. By early 1944, we noticed changes in our daily lives, she later recalled. First, rice became scarce. Then cooking oil disappeared from shops. Later, we had rolling blackouts because factories couldn't get coal. Every week, the newspaper published lists of ships sunk by enemy submarines. Everyone knew someone who had lost a family member at sea. For American submariners, the war was equally personal, but experienced very differently. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Garrity served aboard the USS Barb, under the legendary Commander Eugene Fluckey. We tracked a Japanese convoy for 3 days in February 1944, Garrity recounted. When we attacked, I saw something through the periscope I'll never forget. As one of the ships was sinking, Japanese sailors jumped into the water. Our orders were clear. We couldn't risk rescuing survivors. Watching men struggle in the ocean, knowing we had put them there but couldn't help them, that stays with you. The ethical complexity of submarine warfare weighed on many American officers. Commander George Grider of the USS Flasher expressed this tension in a letter to his wife. We sink ships carrying supplies, but also men. Each victory means dozens, sometimes hundreds of deaths. I remind myself that every tanker we sink means less fuel for the planes bombing our soldiers and Marines. Every freighter means fewer bullets aimed at American boys. It's a harsh calculus, but one we must accept. By mid-1944, Japan's maritime crisis had reached catastrophic proportions. American submarines, now operating in coordinated wolf packs, were sinking ships faster than Japan could build them. More critically, Japan's naval leadership had failed to develop effective countermeasures or even a coherent convoy system until it was too late. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, now commanding his own submarine, observed the deteriorating situation with growing alarm. "We are losing this war at sea," he wrote in June 1944. "Our Navy focuses on saving battleships and carriers for a decisive battle, while America strangles our supply lines. My own family in Kure writes that they have not seen sugar or real coffee for months. Factory workers are malnourished. How can we build ships when our shipyard workers are hungry?" The statistics confirmed Hashimoto's assessment. By the end of 1944, American submarines had sunk over 600 Japanese merchant ships, totaling more than 7 million tons. Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to less than 5 million tons, barely 1/3 of its pre-war capacity. Oil imports, which had averaged 75 million barrels per month in 1941, had fallen to less than 360,000 barrels per month. The consequences for Japan's Navy were dire. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of Japan's carrier fleet, submitted a shocking report to Imperial headquarters in November 1944. Due to critical fuel shortages, our carriers can no longer conduct adequate training operations. New pilot training has been reduced to the bare minimum. Fuel reserves at major naval bases are below 20% of required levels. The contrast with America's logistical situation could not have been more stark. By 1945, the U.S. Navy was deploying newly built fleet carriers that dwarfed their Japanese counterparts. The Essex-class carriers displaced 2,700 tons and carried over 100 aircraft each. More importantly, they operated as part of task forces with unlimited fuel and supplies. Commander David McCampbell, America's top naval ace, described the abundance he experienced aboard the USS Essex. "We never worried about fuel or ammunition. When supplies ran low, fleet oilers and ammunition ships would rendezvous with us. We could conduct operations indefinitely. Our pilots received extensive training before deployment and continued training between combat missions. The Japanese pilots we encountered in 1945 were clearly inexperienced. Some could barely control their aircraft. The human toll of America's submarine campaign became increasingly visible in Japan. Koji Matsuda worked as a clerk at Yokohama Port Authority in early 1945. Ships arrived with their hulls covered in barnacles because there wasn't enough fuel for them to maintain proper speed, he recalled. Crews were often malnourished. One captain told me they had subsisted on rice and pickles for the entire voyage from Singapore. When they unloaded cargo, there were never enough dock workers because many had been conscripted or had left to find food in the countryside. As American submarines tightened their grip on Japan's sea lanes, they increasingly encountered a new and tragic target: prison ships carrying Allied prisoners of war. These unmarked vessels, often called hell ships by their suffering passengers, were legitimate military targets according to the rules of war. But they presented submarine commanders with terrible dilemmas. Commander Joseph Enright of the USS Archer Fish described one such encounter. We tracked what appeared to be a standard transport near Formosa in March 1945. Through the periscope, I saw nothing to indicate it carried prisoners. We fired a spread of torpedoes and scored 2 hits. As the ship listed and began to sink, we surfaced to document the kill. That's when we saw men who were clearly not Japanese in the water. We rescued as many as we could. 27 Australian and British prisoners. They told us hundreds more had been below decks and went down with the ship. Such incidents weighed heavily on submarine commanders and crews. Many carried the burden of unintentional deaths of Allied prisoners for decades after the war. Yet the strategic imperative remained clear. Japan's maritime lifelines had to be cut to end the war as quickly as possible. By early 1945, America's submarine force had effectively won the battle for the Pacific. Japanese shipping had been reduced to coastal convoys, hugging the shoreline, often traveling only at night and frequently not traveling at all. Major warships sat idle at their moorings, preserved from battle but rendered useless by lack of fuel. The statistics were staggering. Throughout the war, American submarines sank 314 Japanese merchant ships totaling 3 million tons, over 55% of Japan's entire merchant fleet. More impressively, this had been accomplished with just 16 South Zenon submariners, less than 2% of U.S. naval personnel. The cost had been high, 52 submarines lost with 506 men, but the strategic impact had been decisive. Captain Mochitsura Hashimoto witnessed the end result of this campaign when he returned to Japan in July 1945 after a patrol. "The harbor at Kure contained the remnants of our once proud navy," he wrote. The battleship Yamato had been sunk. The carriers Amagi and Katsuragi sat idle, unable to operate due to fuel shortages. Destroyers were moored in groups of 3 or 4 to conserve crew. It was the sight not of a defeated navy, but of a navy that had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The final irony came in August 1945 when Hashimoto, commanding the submarine I-58, torpedoed and sank the USS Indianapolis, one of the few significant Japanese submarine successes of the latter war years. Unknown to Hashimoto, the Indianapolis had just delivered components of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island. The weapon that would finally end the war had been safely delivered before his attack. Admiral Motomi Ugaki, one of Japan's last active naval commanders, made a final entry in his diary on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. "The decisive battle we planned never materialized. Instead, we lost our Navy ship by ship, sailor by sailor, as the Americans cut our supply lines and isolated our forces. We prepared for a grand naval battle, but were defeated by submarines we couldn't see and shortages we couldn't overcome. 3 months after Japan's surrender, James Harrington, the young sailor who had survived the sinking of the USS Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor, stood on the deck of the destroyer USS Nicholas as it entered Tokyo Bay. Now a chief petty officer, he surveyed the shattered remnants of Japan's once mighty navy. It was hard to believe this was the same force that had struck us at Pearl Harbor. He later wrote to his wife Betty, "Rusted hulks half submerged in the harbor, ships cannibalized for parts." It reminded me of the Oklahoma and our other battleships on that December morning, except this was virtually Japan's entire navy, not just a portion of ours. The transformation had been complete and from the devastating surprise attack at Pearl Harbor to the methodical destruction of Japan's maritime power, the Pacific War had demonstrated how industrial capacity and strategic adaptation could reverse the most dramatic military setbacks. America had lost 8 battleships in a single morning, then proceeded to build a new and more powerful navy, while systematically destroying Japan's maritime capability through submarine warfare. Perhaps most telling was the human dimension of this remarkable reversal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had studied in America and warned his government before the war. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His words proved prophetic. Yamamoto himself would not live to see their fulfillment. He was killed when his transport plane was shot down in April 1943. His flight path revealed to Americans through the same code-breaking that enabled submarine victories. Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, the aggressive submarine captain who had vowed to make Japan pay for Pearl Harbor, led the USS Wahoo on 9 successful war patrols, sinking 19 Japanese ships totaling 55,000 tons. His submarine failed to return from its 10th patrol in October 1943. Morton and his entire crew were lost, their sacrifice part of the price paid to turn the tide of war. Captain Mochitsura Hashimoto survived the war and later attended memorial services for the men of the Indianapolis whom his submarine had sunk. In an extraordinary act of reconciliation, he testified at the court-martial of the Indianapolis's captain, Charles McVeigh, stating that zigzagging would not have prevented the ship's sinking. Hashimoto later became a Shinto priest, dedicating his life to peace. The strategic lessons were equally profound. Japan had optimized its navy for a decisive surface battle that never occurred on its terms, while America adapted to wage economic warfare that systematically dismantled Japan's ability to fight. Japanese Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka summarized this insight in a post-war analysis. "We studied the great naval battles of history and prepared to refight them with modern weapons. The Americans created a new kind of war that rendered our preparations obsolete." As the occupation of Japan began in September 1945, American submarine commanders were among the first to witness the full impact of their campaign. Commander Eugene Fluckey, whose USS Barb had sunk 17 Japanese ships, visited Yokohama and Tokyo. "The people were starving," he observed. "Warehouses stood empty. Factory machinery sat idle for lack of materials. We had not merely defeated Japan's navy, we had collapsed their entire war-making capacity by cutting the sea lanes that sustained it." The final statistics tell the story of this remarkable reversal. In December 1941, Japan possessed 5 million tons of merchant shipping. By August 1945, only 8 million tons remained, a 72% reduction. The Imperial Japanese Navy began the war with 10 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 38 cruisers, 112 destroyers, and 65 submarines. When Japan surrendered, it retained only 4 carriers, all damaged or incomplete, 4 battleships, none operational due to fuel shortages, 2 cruisers, 23 destroyers, and 59 submarines. most immobilized by lack of fuel and trained crew. The reversal that began at Pearl Harbor and ended in Tokyo Bay represented not just a military victory, but a triumph of industrial capacity, strategic adaptation, and human resolve. America's submarine force, representing less than 2% of naval personnel, had effectively neutralized the Japanese Navy that had appeared invincible on that Sunday morning in December 1941. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. And check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.